Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. So I thought to read from Stillness Flowing today, as usual. And these are from the trips Luang Por Chah took to the West. Once again, page 774 of Stillness Flowing, the chapter A Broader Canvas. And this section is Like a Worm. On the 9th of June, back in Seattle, Luang Por took his meal at the house of a Thai family. Afterwards, he spoke about the decline in the Thai Sangha. In what Paul would call his faux grumbling mood, Luang Por spoke of how men were becoming monks to maintain the custom more than to get any real value from the time spent in robes. It was not like in the old days, when people would spend at least 3 years as monks. The owner of the house had been away from Thailand long enough to have no qualms about openly expressing his disagreement. He said, quote, "Suppose that every Thai man was to become a monk for 4 or 5 years. Nothing would ever get done. If everyone became monks, there would be nobody doing any work in the country. That's how I see it." Luang Por chuckled. To laughs all around, he said that was how earthworms thought. He quoted an old folk story that the reason worms excrete the earth that they've just eaten is because they are afraid that otherwise there will soon be none left. Of course, it was impossible that worms could digest all the earth in the world. The idea that encouraging people to spend longer in robes was going to destroy the economy was equally unrealistic. It just wasn't going to happen. Quote, "You couldn't even get everyone to be a monk for 7 or 15 days. Some people become monks for all their life, some for 5 or 6 years, some for 6 or 7 days. It's natural for it to be like that." End quote. On returning to the Capel house, Luang Por sat talking to Paul, and the conversation turned to a friend of his who had been coming to listen to Luang Por's teachings. Quote, "Catherine had told me that she felt that Luang Por's teaching was true, but it was impossible to practice in this society." He replied that people use similar arguments in Thailand. "I'm so young, I don't have the opportunity to practice, but when I'm old, I'll practice." Luang Por asked, "Would you say, 'I'm young, so I don't have time to eat. When I get older, I'll eat'?" Again, he poked me with his cane and said, "If this were on fire, would you say, 'I'm suffering, it's true, but since I live in this society, I can't get away from it'?" I mentioned that Catherine's husband liked to go rock climbing, and she felt that it was like a meditation practice for him. Luang Por asked, "When he climbs on the rocks, does he see the Four Noble Truths?" I said that I didn't know, though perhaps he didn't. Then I said that sometimes I thought that when someone does a worldly activity with full attention, there can be deep concentration. For example, a musician might have factors of jhana present when he plays, such as one-pointedness, rapture, and so on, except that it was in an unskillful way. Luang Por just said, "No, nobody plays music and enters jhana. Only Westerners. You people don't know about jhana." He asked me about Zen once more, so I recited the Heart Sutta for him, doing the best I could with a spontaneous translation. Footnote, a seminal text of Mahayana Buddhism, in which all the key teachings of the Theravada Buddhist tradition are negated in order to illuminate the meaning of emptiness. When I finished, he said, "No emptiness either, no bodhisattva." He asked me where the sutra came from, and I said it was reputed to have been spoken by the Buddha. No Buddha. Then he said, there is talking about deep wisdom beyond all conventions, but it doesn't mean that we should ignore the conventions. How could we teach without them? We have to use names for things. Isn't that so? Insight Meditation Society. On the 10th of June, Luang Por, Ajahn Chah, and Paul flew to New York en route to the Insight Meditation Society, IMS, a retreat center in Barre, Massachusetts. They were traveling there at the invitation of one of the center's founders, Jack Cornfield, who had spent some months as a monk at Wat Pah Pong a few years before. As they began their journey, Paul found that Luang Por was still having severe difficulties with North American geography. Was Massachusetts also in the United States, he asked? What about Boston? Was that New York? Luang Por stayed at IMS for 8 days and taught at a retreat attended by around 70 meditators. In the mornings, Luang Por would spend time with the staff, mostly old students of the center, giving them the opportunity to ask questions. In the afternoon, he would conduct a question and answer session with the retreatants, and in the evening, he would lead a meditation session and give a discourse. Paul, who was helping with the translation, remembered, quote, "For his morning sessions with the staff, he quickly established the theme of facing the executioner. When people came in, he would ask, 'Did you do your homework today?' He told them they should think about death at least 3 times a day, once in the morning, afternoon, and evening. Don't be like Po, that's what he'd started calling me. It's like the Thai corruption of the Pali word Bodhi, i.e. enlightenment, and commonly used as a name. He'd say, 'He just walks around. He looks at trees and the birds. He eats his lunch. He never thinks that he's going to die someday.' I became the straight man for him, and he would sometimes prompt him with questions. The idea of death is usually remote, I once told him. If I felt some danger, it might be more real. 'Don't you see the danger?' he said. 'Every breath.' I said that I usually felt that, for me, death was far in the future. I was destined to live a long time, 100 years or more. 'That's the wisdom of Devadatta,' he replied. During the retreat, he emphasized the Four Noble Truths and the guiding principles of practice. He answered many questions about meditation. Quote, "On the level of access concentration, you can compare the mind to a chicken imprisoned in its coop. It's still walking around. It's not motionless. It's not asleep. It's not dead. But it has a limit to its movements that is in your control. Once the mind is pacified, then investigate the body. Investigate the 32 parts of the body. If your mind is still agitated, then keep your eye on the thoughts and emotions that your mind fabricates. See them for what they are, impermanent, impersonal, without any abiding selfhood. In practice, it's not necessary to know a lot of things, but merely to maintain awareness right at this point until there arises a sense of disenchantment and dispassion. Then you will let go of attachment to the 5 hindrances, and it is that which is the goal of meditation." End quote. There was a question about the 5 aggregates. Do the 5 aggregates have any effect on peace? Is meditation practice the basis for understanding the 5 hindrances? He answered, "With wisdom, the 5 aggregates will help you to be liberated. If you are foolish, then they will cause you suffering. If you're foolish, you can say they are like thieves who rob you. But if you understand their true nature, they can make you enlightened. It's like you don't know Ajahn Chah. You've just heard his name and seen his picture. It's still not enough. But today, you've met him and spoken with him, which means that you know one part of him. If you realize the Dhamma that he's taught to you, then you would know all of him." Plowing up the Stump. On the 2nd day of the retreat, Luang Por made a suggestion. Listening to the Dhamma in a large group is difficult. A large pot of curry doesn't taste so delicious. There are too many things mixed together, not enough to go around. It doesn't taste so good. A small pot of curry is more delicious. It would be better to divide into smaller groups for discussion. So, from that day onwards, the retreatants were divided into 5 discussion groups of about 15 people each, so that everyone would have a chance to ask Luang Por questions more conveniently. To a query on the goal of practice, he replied, "We come here to practice in order that we won't have to practice in the future. We're born in order not to be born again. We do this so we don't have to do it again. We practice so that the mind may disengage from sensuality and suffering, in order that there will be no more suffering in the future." Paul observed, In group interviews, Luang Por generally gave direct and simple answers to complicated questions. He told people to put the books away, to rely on themselves, to have determination and perseverance. Many problems didn't require a lot of thinking. All that was required was the patience to bear with the unpleasant until conditions revealed themselves as impermanent and empty. People would continually talk about the difficulties they faced as lay practitioners. He said that it was difficult to practice as a householder. It's like trying to meditate in prison. You sit down and begin, and the prison officer comes and shouts, "Get up, march over there." Luang Por returned to a familiar theme: Dhamma practice as eliminating the underlying cause of suffering, rather than juggling the symptoms. He reprised a favorite simile. It's like you go for a walk and you trip over a stump. So you get a hatchet and cut it off at the ground level, but it grows back and you trip over it again. So you cut it off again. But it keeps on growing back. This goes on and on. You're better off getting a tractor and plowing it up. He pointed to the inherent conflict in wishing fervently to be free of the suffering that arises from indulgence in defilement, without having to let go of the defilement itself. Some people couldn't bear to lose the pleasure they derived from the defilement. Others claimed that it was impossible to let go. And yet they still hoped for a solution. He said that it was like sitting on an anthill. The ants are biting, you're feeling uncomfortable, but you refuse to get up and move somewhere else. Quote, or you come to the teacher holding something burning hot in your hand, and you complain, "Ajahn, this is hot." The teacher says, "So put it down." And you say, "I can't put it down, but I don't want it to be hot. So what can the teacher do for you?" End quote. Meditators could spend their whole life going back and forth with themselves, trying to find what exactly they needed to do to let go of the defilements. It was like contemplating a journey. Quote, you ask yourself, should I go today? Should I? Maybe I'll go tomorrow. Then the next day, should I go? Should I or shouldn't I? And you keep on doing this day after day until you die, and you never go anywhere. You've got to think, go, and be done with it. End quote. Successful translation depends on the audience being confident that the translator is accurately representing the words of the speaker. Luang Por's mischievousness appeared while Jack Cornfield was translating for him. Jack remembered him saying, "Even though I don't speak any English, I know the truth is that my translator leaves out all the really hard things I say. I tell you painful things, and he leaves out all the things that have a sting in them, makes them sound soft and gentle for you. You can't trust him." End quote. When asked questions about the state of the world, Luang Por would encourage the questioner to focus on the world of direct experience, rather than the one that could be read about in the newspapers. You're asking about the world. Do you know what the world is? It's just the senses and their objects, and the ignorance that grasps at them. Personal experience was the only way to verify the teachings. When asked about enlightenment, he said that it was like the taste of a banana. You had to put it in your mouth before you could know the taste. Every now and then, Pa would get a spontaneous personal teaching. One afternoon, when the session was over, I was unplugging my tape recorder, and I touched the metal prong of the plug while it was still connected. I got a shock and dropped it immediately. Luang Por noticed, and he said, "Oh, how come you could let go of that so easily? Who told you to?" It was a good illustration of what he was trying to teach. Finally, he told people that they were always welcome to come to his monastery and stay for a while. Wat Pah is like a factory, he said. After the product is finished, it can be sent out into the world. But it's easier to train people if they're far from home. Po ran away, he said. If I were younger, I'd drag him back by his ear. Following the retreat, Luang Por met with the Korean Zen master Suan Sa Nim. They both seemed to greatly enjoy the meeting. Paul remembered Luang Por being particularly taken with one of his new friend's stories. A Zen monk sneaks into a lecture hall where some great scholar is talking about one mind. All things come from the one mind, the scholar teaches, at which the Zen monk comes forth and challenges him. You say all things come from the one mind. Okay, so now tell me, where does the one mind come from? When the preacher was unable to answer, the monk beat him. Luang Por laughed and said, he deserved a beating, all right. Afterwards, he repeated this several times, laughing and saying what a good story that was. He couldn't answer where the one mind comes from, so he really deserved a beating. After a couple of days with the Buddhist community at the appropriately named Anicca farm, Luang Por flew back to England. Second. In England, on the 22nd of June, this is in England, sorry. Before joining the Sangha at Chithurst, Luang Por returned to Oakenholt in Oxfordshire, where he attended the ordination ceremony of a young Englishman who was entering into the Burmese Sangha with the highly respected master, Mahasayadaw, as his preceptor. The occasion afforded a telling glimpse of the differences between the Asian and European sensibilities. For many of the English guests brought up in a non-Buddhist culture, the contrast between the two renowned Theravada monks, the engaging Luang Por, seen as warm, and the undemonstrative Sayadaw, seen as cold, was startling. Luang Por seemed more inspiring. It was clear that in a non-Buddhist country, where the Arahant ideal was not firmly established, the personality of the teacher was much more vital to the arising of faith than it was in a traditional Buddhist nation. It seemed that people were much less likely to ask themselves, would I like to be as wise as him, as they were to ask, would I like to be that kind of person? Luang Por arrived in Chithurst to see the first tangible fruit of the decision he had made to allow his monks to come to the West, and the advice he had given. The gifting of the woodland had been a vindication of his insistence that, while in London, the monks maintain their practice of alms round, even if they receive no food in their bowls. He had explained that alms round is not only about gathering food, but also about being seen. Alms round provides an occasion in which monastics, simply through their appearance and deportment, may inspire those who see them to try to find out more about the Dhamma. Over the years, Luang Por had often recounted the story of how Venerable Asaji was first seen by a wandering ascetic who would go on to seek out the Buddha and eventually become the great disciple Venerable Sariputta. In the present case, it was not a wandering ascetic, but Paul James, a jogger on Hampstead Heath, who became inspired and followed the monks back to the temple. Some months later, after getting to know and trust Ajahn Sumedho and his fellow monks, Paul revealed to them a non-spiritual problem that he was struggling with. He had received an area of woodland, hammerwood, as an inheritance, with the condition that he neither sold it nor cut down the trees. The forest had become a financial burden on him, and he was looking to donate it to an appropriate charitable body. Would the Sangha be interested? I'm going to skip ahead a bit. This is how they were reconstituting the house at Chithurst, the new property. Ajahn Amaro arrived the following year from Thailand. He was unfazed by the work ahead, confident that the training he'd received from Luang Por had fully prepared him for it. It was not seen as a great imposition on our practice. It was just simply, we practice with this. You wear your boiler suit, you put your pack of dry rot fluid on your back, and you climb into your chimney with your spray gun and you meditate. You see that Luang Por's concern with our ability to adapt and to develop the right attitude to whatever situation was occurring was far more important than having precise conditions for formal meditation practice. It was making the quality of adaptation the most important thing, the readiness to live in peace with the world, rather than getting the world to fit your idea of what peace is. The last night. On the evening of the 27th of June, his last night at Chithurst before returning to Thailand, Luang Por met with the Sangha for an evening of conversation and exhortation. The tape recording made that night captures wonderfully the warmth and informality of the occasion. Monks and zestful are two words not commonly linked in one sentence, but the conviviality, punctuated by gales of laughter, is tangible. It was the old magic of Luang Por, making people feel by his presence that they'd never in their lives been so happy and contented. He also took the opportunity to show off his only English phrase, just a few sentences into a more formal Dhamma talk. A layperson entered the room with a new tray of hot drinks. Here we go again, another cup of tea? Footnote, a Pali word from the mealtime blessing, Luang Por's mnemonic for a cup of tea. End quote. And in the Dhamma talk that night, he gave his disciples encouragement and support in their propagation of the Dhamma. He said, "If you make an effort to teach people, you teach yourself at the same time. You become smarter, you reflect more." Investigating the self-doubts and fears that arose when one first started to teach was part of the benefit to the teacher. If you're meditating, if you're mindful, then teaching others is teaching yourself. Then there's no harm in it. As for the subject of talks, he advised, giving, morality, heaven, the drawbacks of sensuality, the benefits of renunciation. However many talks you may give, always keep them within the bounds of those topics. Their source is sila, samadhi, and panya. Throughout your life of teaching, never stray from these topics. He advised against too much eclecticism. There needed to be a coherent house style. If you're teaching mindfulness of breathing, all of you should teach it in the same way. Similarly, with the investigation of the body, don't introduce teachings from other traditions. It's confusing. One person starts teaching Zen, another Tibetan Buddhism, and it's a complete muddle. People here are very confused already. If you give them a bit of this and a bit of that, it will be such a muddle that, before long, they won't absorb anything at all. You must all teach in a common idiom, so that there will be harmony of approach. If students master the basic practice, then they will understand other traditions by themselves. But if you teach a lot of different traditions, then they won't grasp the underlying principles. He warned against sectarianism. Monks should not fall into the trap of comparing traditions or praising their own path at the expense of others. Tell people that they don't have to abandon their former practices. They can hold on to them. But for now, give this a try. Just do this one thing for the time being and see what happens. Don't answer the phone. Luang Por reminded the monks that even the Buddha said that teaching was difficult. People do not relinquish their delusions easily. He cautioned them not to get discouraged and gave an example of his own experience. Sometimes you'd get fed up with it. At the beginning, sometimes I'd lay there in the middle of the night and feel like taking my bowl and running away from my disciples. It was all so frustrating. But when I reflected on the Dhamma, I realized that I couldn't do that. I asked myself, if you're not going to teach deluded people, who are you going to teach? I was the one who was deluded into thinking I was special. A telephone rang in another room, which nobody wanted to answer. Ajahn Chah asked, "Wouldn't it be better to be a Pacceka Buddha?" Quote, "It would be good. The Pacceka Buddha has no suffering, but it's best not to be anything at all. It's hard work being a Buddha, and don't be a Pacceka Buddha either. As soon as you are something, then it gets difficult. Don't be anything at all. If you think you are Venerable Sumedho or Venerable Anando, then you'll suffer. Right now, there's no Anando and there's no Sumedho. How can that be? Well, those names are just conventions, aren't they? The moment when you become them, then you suffer. If there's a Sumedho, then Sumedho gets angry. If there's an Anando, then Anando gets angry. If there's no Sumedho or Anando, then there's nobody to answer the phone." Answering or not answering the telephone became a metaphor for their response to sense impingement. Ring, ring, ring. You couldn't care less. Nothing happens. There's no suffering. But if you are somebody, then as soon as the phone rings, you go to pick it up. It's suffering. You've got to use wisdom to get rid of Sumedho. Don't let there be any Anando to pick up the phone. Don't be Sumedho. Don't be Anando. Use those words only as conventions. Don't take things on board. People may call you good or bad, but don't identify with the things, but be aware. And when you're aware, Do you take things on? No, that's the end. Earthquakes. In the course of their conversation, Ajahn Sumedho referred to various predictions that the next few years were likely to see a number of major earthquakes and other natural disasters. Luang Por replied, "The Buddha taught us to look at the present. Astrologers say something's going to happen in another 2 years, but we don't have to wait that long. It's too far away. How could it be 2 years? It's happening right now. Can't you see? 3 years before an earthquake? There's an earthquake right now. Look, America's shaking really strongly. You think certain things, and this earth shakes." He points at his chest. "We don't see it. The external earthquakes are rare. I've never seen one in my life. But in this earth, there are tremors every day, every minute. As soon as we're born, we start wailing. There, that's an earthquake." Luang Por said that because each person's earth quaked just a small amount every day, it was overlooked. Movement was natural and inevitable. It was a good thing. If there was no change, then people would stay as babies when they were born and nobody would grow up. If nobody got old and died, where would everybody live? The problem, he said, was that people didn't look at the nature of things, and so nobody wanted to die. It's like you don't want this glass to be full, but you keep steadily pouring water into it. When all was said and done, there was only one way to be free from death. When you see with wisdom that nothing is truly me or mine, you realize the deathless.
I appreciated that quote from Ajahn Amaro. He's talking about going up and painting in the attic in Chithurst, and how Luang Por taught them to be mindful in all situations, and because this is one of the most common questions that comes up now, like with Luang Por Liam, like how do we be mindful when we're working? And Luang Por Liam has developed his panya and his teaching ability almost to an Ajahn Chah level at this point, present day. So like, you would say like, if you think you're working, you're already suffering. So he's coming back to just the postures, or just moving the body.
I also like the comments just about, as a community, trying to keep the practices, relatively consistent within of course, a circumscribed variation as we get the teachings, the different practices and different orientations, but not to get lost in exploring, way different traditions and bringing them in and trying to integrate them. You end up with kind of a bit of a mess if you do too much of that, until you're firmly grounded anyway.
I also really liked the bit on the importance of conventions, and because it just in the West we really do love the deep, the koans and all the sort of deep wisdom teachings, but just that basic of like how do you follow your breath, or not get drunk every week, it's like far less romantic, or the practices of body contemplation and things. Just it's just people sometimes overlook those basics for the high panya teachings, I think. So I appreciated that.
I also liked the kind of like rock climbing and music analogies. That was quite good.
Only Westerners get jhana from listening to music.
Well, can you get jhana from these mindful activities?
Right.
Just so only Westerners can do that.
Just also all the predictions about the future and disasters and just pointing out to the earthquake happening, right now. And just like I remember at the Wat Papong Memorial for Luang Por Chah 2 years ago, Ajahn Chah spoke about how it was so many in prison because they saw their suffering, whereas people in middle-class America just, he said, that's how it is with reasonably comfortable people. They just don't see their suffering. And then you read statistics on depression rates in, upper middle-class society in the US are 6 times that of, those in developing countries. Like, it's just, when you really want to look at the oppression of the spirit, our comfortable life provides it in spades. And it's just interesting to kind of pointing that out to people. It's very hard to, I guess, figure out how to show, it's just hard for people to see that they're sick, I guess.
Yeah, it's like at Pujamgong, that village, it's pretty rare that you see a depressed person in these poor villages. They're just very, very basic. Like I was thinking once, like even the village drunk doesn't seem depressed. That's just his thing. He's just like playing his part.
It reminds me of a quote by Ajahn Sumedho. He was talking about the depression of the people in the West, using someone in Norway as an example who he has work guaranteed, he has healthcare guaranteed, everything is there. He's in his nice apartment with glazed windows, sitting in his lazy boy recliner, and all I can think is, I want to kill myself. Because there's just no effort involved in having to get by. Whereas for people in a poor village in Thailand, they can't think too much about. I think the pointlessness of life or something, because they have work to do, whereas Westerners, not so much.
Yeah, it's interesting how that works.
Just another aspect of that might be that the work that people do in a poor village is it's viscerally connected to their support. You know how you feed yourself. Whereas the work that one does in an industrialized or post-industrialized country is often very abstract, and your food comes from who knows where. And that may be significant as well.
Yeah, it's like working in a cubicle. It's very disconnected.
I also think it's like the sense of meaning comes from the sense of the gravity of like every action and what the effects could be. And I think that's the beauty of the Buddhist path, is that it, by overlaying even, a very mundane life with the perception that every act is just an ornament of the mind, and that task of purifying the mind is in fact very important, the most important one, then it can, with proper practice of mindfulness and kind of these supports, it can infuse, that same life which makes, the man want to kill himself. It can, because we can't all go out and live in nature and, or in this or that situation, although living in community I think is really helpful. But I think that by overlaying the practice of mindfulness and the path on people's lives, that it can actually provide that missing sense of meaning.
I would totally agree with that, because most people, I can't speak for most people, I assume that most people don't overlay onto their lives this sort of life or death, samsaric sort of situation that they're in, like in terms of rebirth, in terms of making karma, and if I make good karma or bad karma, like what kind of birth am I going to take? When you like overlay that onto the whole situation, there's plenty to do, plenty of meaning and